You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Welcome to On the Way Home, a podcast where we explore the journey towards ending homelessness and building strong, supportive communities, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly. Today, I'm joined by a returning guest whose voice is both respected and deeply rooted in the sector, John Fox. John is a lawyer and partner at Robbins Appleby and one of the sharpest minds working in the intersection of housing, policy, and equity. John's joined us before and has already answered our signature question, what does home mean to you? So today, I'm switching it up. Thank you, John, for joining me today on the way home. You've gotten to answer our signature question multiple times before, and so I wanted to ask you instead, what's something about the meaning of home that's changed for you over time and why?
Well, I think I've always said something along the lines of it's sort of safety and security, but the more time I spend in the housing sector and the more you read about housing around the world, the luckier I feel about just being able to have a home and to have a bad day and go there and get to go home after a bad day. And it's just not everybody gets to do that. So I feel luckier than I did when I first came on this podcast.
Before we dive in, can you give our listeners a little bit of a refresher on yourself, share a bit of background to the work that you do?
Sure. So I'm a lawyer, the bulk of my practice is with nonprofit and co-ops and sector organizations. So I do work bringing public-private partnerships or nonprofit partnerships together. I do work advancing nonprofit development, and in the sector writ large, I do some things like amalgamations of nonprofits and things like that. I've been involved in the housing sector since I joined Toronto Community Housing way back now in, I guess, 05, 06, and was there for 7 years and kind of continued in that space with these amazing folks after coming back to private practice.
So this year, John actually delivered the opening speech for Blue Door's AGM. And, you know, there's awesome opening speeches and then there's really awesome opening speeches. And I felt this was a really awesome opening speech and I wanted to bring it on the podcast because I feel like it's telling about the possibilities that there are for nonprofits and charities as we look to the future of housing. John, in your speech, you opened with a very striking statistical metaphor. You said for every new affordable home built in Canada, 10 are lost. And I'm hoping you can unpack that for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak. It's a bit brave to ask a lawyer to speak at an AGM. And I'm always very grateful for the chance to speak about something not law or some new change in legislation. It's great to be able to talk about the housing sector writ large and what I get to see of it, because I get to see more than one nonprofit and more than one opinion and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that is really acute right now is that housing's having a real moment. And one of the reasons for that is we've become increasingly aware of the fact that through the process of revitalization of units, where they're purchased by a private sector entity and then repurposed or improved. I'm not even going to cast judgment in this, those units just move out of affordability. So there is that number came from a study prepared by the Canadian the Collaborative for Evidence of Canadian Housing. I just got that wrong, but outfit out of McMaster and Hamilton. And they were looking at the loss of units that are affordable to people on minimum wage, so roughly $750 a month in rent. And across Canada in the last 10 years or so, or their stats were between 2011 and 2021, so the last census, for every newly affordable building unit that was created, I said 10 in my speech. The stat is actually 11 in their paper. but it varies across the country. So that stat appears in some ways nicer in Toronto, where it's 1 for 2, but that's just because there aren't that many affordable units here to start with. So it's not necessarily a good thing. So it does vary across the country from place to place. But the main point is, in the rush to say we're creating new units, we're forgetting that as we to use an analogy used by one of my colleagues, as we push the carpet open ahead of us, it's rolling out behind us at a faster pace. So it's important to be aware of that and to try and deal with the fact that we're losing affordability faster than we can build it.
I just want to call out for the listeners, for anyone who would like to read the full speech or follow along as we're talking, you can go to Blue Door's website, and under media and articles, you can find the blog version of John's speech. So John, I'm wondering if you could tell us about the Tenant co-op deal in Hamilton. You mentioned them paying around $250K per unit versus $600K for new builds.
Yeah.
What are they doing? How did they do it? What makes that story so powerful? And what lessons does it offer to our sector?
Well, the story is very powerful because it's such a personal, an amazing and somewhat lucky story. So this is a story of what was an apartment building in Hamilton, in which one of the residents happened to be a real estate professional and was tasked with looking for buildings online as for various reasons. And what she discovered one day was that her own building was up for sale. So she went door to door and talked to her fellow residents, and they ultimately got together. And they weren't necessarily close before, but they are now. They got together and they formed themselves into a co-op, and they made an offer to buy the building themselves as the co-op. And I'm not going to tell you it was easy. This took place over a lot of time and took something like 5 different kinds of loans and to piece together. There's no actual mechanism. There's no public support mechanism that is specific to this particular kind of acquisition. At least there wasn't then. I'll talk about what's coming in the future later in the podcast. But they overcame all of this. All of these challenges, and they ultimately, their co-op now owns the building and they control their own destiny. And that also means they have to make repairs to the furnace and the building as time comes on and all that kind of stuff. So whether they pay the right price or not, I suppose will be determined in 10 years. But for now, what we know is that group bonded together, created their own co-op, and took those units off the market and put them in their own control. That's a pretty compelling story. It doesn't always have to be that compelling, but this is happening now. This is now a big topic of discussion, in part not just because of stories like the one in Hamilton, but the BC Rental Acquisition Fund has an extraordinary statistic. In 2024, something like 1/2 of every rental asset transfer of multi-res in British Columbia had that rental acquisition fund as part of its backing, which means it went into the hands of nonprofits through an organized entity that was providing financing for that purpose. So that kind of intervention did not exist for the group in Hamilton. It does exist in British Columbia, and the federal government is looking at creating a similar function to exist and be available across the country.
You described 3 major shifts coming our way: transfers of vintage assets from private to nonprofits, federal Build Canada homes, and development charge exemptions for nonprofits. Which of these do you see as the most transformative, and why?
It's a tough question because in some ways housing is having this moment, and there's a part of me that doesn't want to say one's going to be more transformative than the other, because I don't want any policymakers, listeners, to think that maybe one will do and the others won't. They're all quite different. I had just alluded to a rental acquisition fund, so there is a RFP in place, which is at the federal level, which is intended to create that opportunity, and so you could see significant shifts, and in some ways that's the easiest. We in your last question you asked about the costing. There's a significant difference between the cost of purchasing a existing unit and maintaining it as affordable and building one. I mean, you could see from around you, and even in the private market, there's very little new building going on. That's because of the cost of construction. So buying an existing building is a tremendous economic benefit. Like it's less than half the cost, and so that kind of thing could be quite impactful. On the second intervention, where you may have the federal government coming back into the business of actually developing housing directly, could mean there's a creation of net new units on federal land in order to create additional either rent controlled units or low income units or whatever the program happens to be. That's it's not really known yet. I can get into that in as much detail as anybody else soon. And development charges that exist today. And what has been interesting about the change in development charges, namely that under the Development Charges Act, a nonprofit does not pay development charges at all, means that for a nonprofit to develop, for instance, a mixed building with some market rental and some below market rental, there's no development charge on any of those units. So in some municipalities where a development charge might be $60,000, if you have a 300 unit development, that's a lot of money. And when you think about how a municipality might compete for a partner to develop a piece of vacant land, they would go in an RFP and they'd say, well, I will welcome nonprofits and for-profits. But the nonprofits right now have the advantage of not paying development charges, which is a significant edge. And I think it will cause particularly developers who are facing a fair amount of stress to look to keeping their teams together by bidding through nonprofits or partnering with nonprofits who would own the land from the get-go in order to have that advantage. Now that may change. If you're reading the papers, you know there's a lot of pressure on development charges. The City of Vaughan reduced development charges. The Government of Canada has said that it would like to see municipalities reduce development charges and would then replace that money, essentially shifting those costs from the development itself onto the general tax base. But those are all things which are coming and are putting pressure on the taxes that are associated with development. Because of that, it could be that you'll see an evening out of that advantage, and the advantage to the nonprofit will not be as acute as it is today.
So, if we can go back to Build Canada Homes for a minute and talk about direct housing delivery, how do you envision nonprofits shaping their role in that plan? What do we need to do to prepare now?
Well, nobody knows exactly what that plan is because it is in midstream of development within the federal government. And so nobody can tell exactly what it is, but we do know, based on the actual Liberal platform, that part of the intention is to develop on existing public lands and to bring the federal government back directly into the business of developing housing. So any way you slice it, though, the debate is only whether or not the Government of Canada should be directly engaged in development or whether it should just fund. That's where the debate is. There isn't a debate really on should the Government of Canada actually directly operate nonprofit housing. In both the case of the movement of existing rental to the nonprofit sector and the creation of new housing on federal lands, to the extent that it is below market and to the extent that there's a role for nonprofits, there will be a tremendous operating role, which means that in the course of the next, let's call it 5 years, there could be a significant net new amount of units that will be available for the nonprofit world to manage, for the community housing sector writ large to manage. That's not a small challenge for the community housing sector, and it's one that I think we have to be ready to grapple with as those things come online.
How do we get ready?
How do we get ready? Well, we get ready by first of all making sure that we have the management capacity to take that on, understanding what is likely to come, and also, when we're talking with our private asset manager partners who may be looking to divest, we want to be able to have some measure of control over what's being divested and when we can absorb those units. Being ready to do that is not easy, because when you're talking about, say, a large building and you're adding 200 or 300 units of affordable housing in one go, that means adding staff and doing all that kind of stuff. So you can't add staff in advance for obvious reasons, but being ready for it in terms of the infrastructure that you have is important. There's also the way the BC fund works. It's an opportunistic sort of fund. So the nonprofits just say, I want to buy that building, and the fund helps create that deal. So when as that particular system comes on stream, looking for ways in which you are actually ahead of the curve, not waiting for it to happen, but saying, our strategic plan is to have more housing in this area. Therefore, I would like to talk to this private rental owner about acquiring units in that area, is something that a nonprofit can be prepared to do as it looks at its own footprint over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think it has to look at that.
When you talk about asset transfers from private owners, you mentioned a cap rate. Am I saying that right?
Correct.
Cap rate rep, and a national $1.5 billion RFP on the way. How should organizations position themselves to respond?
Well, with that RFP, if you haven't responded, it's too late. It's the responses are in, but the winners will be intermediaries. They won't really necessarily be straight up nonprofits, or there'll be a collection of nonprofits. So I'm obviously guessing at who's responded. But what will happen is that those intermediaries will begin to play the same role that I just described. So either they will be able to absorb units and then disperse them into the community housing sector over time, or they will look to match up before the transaction occurs, a nonprofit with a sale. So a nonprofit looking to take advantage of that would be very interested in following the results of that. Certainly if they know people who have bid, then they might get not inside information, but they might get information as it becomes available to them, as it becomes public, and start to know and understand the nature of the intermediary and what's available, and then take advantage of that as it comes on stream. So I think the fellow I referred to there, I don't remember his name, but it was on stage at the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association conference in Ottawa last year. And essentially what he was saying is, we'd like to reposition some of these assets. Our first choice is the nonprofit sector. And when he said it, I was looking around the room, and certainly there's a few people rolling their eyes thinking, that's nice, but I don't want your bottom end assets, or the assets that you like to call vintage. I want something else. But in reality, it's very important for us to look at that as a transaction. So it's not whether you're taking the units. We want the units to remain affordable, but the nonprofit acquiring them, or perhaps with the help of an intermediary, has to get the pricing right, because you're going to manage it, and it's going to cost money to maintain, and it will be an older building. And so that will all fit into how much is actually paid on closing, and how much is financed, and so on. So that will all work itself into the overall deal. Being prepared to engage in a discussion at that level is something that I think nonprofits will have to aspire to do, but I don't think they're going to have to do it alone, just as nonprofits in British Columbia don't have to do it alone. Nonprofits here, through that RFP, will have an ally in managing that kind of process, should they choose to engage in it.
So I recognize I'm kind of jumping around on your thoughts, but you've talked about how development charge exemptions provide a huge cost advantage for nonprofits, millions in savings. How can that kind of leverage change partnerships or funding strategies going forward?
Well, right, it all depends on who pulls the permit. So whoever pulls the permit pays the development charges or doesn't pay the development charge. So look for either nonprofits to be brought into a situation where a private developer has owned land, has developed the plans, is ready to go, but it does not make financial sense on the market, and they say, okay, well, Blue Door, for example, we'd like to come to a deal with you where you pull the permit, you build it, it's for you, we'll keep the team together, and of course we sell you the land, and there's a large financial there's obviously a financial deal there in terms of acquisition and so on. But yeah, that is one possibility. Another possibility is where the development community moves forward on its own, creates a nonprofit. The land gets sold from a for-profit to a nonprofit at fair market value, and then is developed after that. And they look for an operator, someone who has experience with managing units that are occupied by people with low income, to come in and operate the building afterwards, or provide support services to a portion of the building that requires it. There's any number of possibilities and examples of that happening out there today. And of different ways that a nonprofit can intervene in a building like that. Now, I have to say that most nonprofits, when we talk about this, gravitate to wanting to build asset base and wanting to be able to manage surpluses off a given building to help deal with deficits on other buildings, all that kind of stuff. And so I think you can expect while there's lots of ways of doing this, I think you can expect nonprofits to look to be owners, to look to build assets, to look to long-term income streams, and to look to having their own source of stability on their own balance sheets in order to assure their survival. And certainly when I say housing's having a moment, like all these things are coming together at the same time. And so there is some leverage for nonprofits who are capable of delivering when dealing either with the private sector or the government, to ensure that they get what they need and want out of the deal for their own long-term survival strategy. So we've gone past the time when nonprofits were limited to, we built a single building, we're just going to manage the people in the building, we're going to pay down our mortgage, and that's it, we're satisfied. Most nonprofits are looking for a broader footprint in their communities and to a long-term stability in their strategic plans. And so this kind of activity, if I'm the ED of a nonprofit, I'm looking for the opportunity to build asset, to build income stream, and so on. And that's where things like land trusts can come in. You can have a relationship with a land trust that is specifically targeted at owning land, and then having other smaller nonprofits operate it. So there's a lot of potential ways of going about doing this.
I'm gonna come back to something you said about the opportunity for organizations to be viable or financially sound as a result of some of what's coming down the pipeline. Do you feel that's a priority, or do you actually feel that some organizations maybe have the opportunity to look at merging or doing something else to further the agenda of housing as compared to organizational viability?
So I actually think you have two questions in there, so I want to try and answer them both. I don't think there's complete alignment with all the players in terms of nonprofits should use this opportunity to build their own asset base. Sometimes you'll hear it more as, we'll build it, we'll just get a nonprofit to come on a contract and operate it. And I'm not sure that kind of contractual element is a good long-term solution for nonprofits. And I think there will be leverage to kind of manage that. The other piece you mentioned has a deeper element. So you're asking about what the community housing sector can do to be ready for this kind of thing. So one of the most important ways is to do our part of this. So we have a lot of nonprofits and co-ops in Ontario, and some of them were created a long time ago and are small, and they've paid off their mortgages and so on. And there is, in fact, land equity which is sitting untapped in those organizations. This is not a critique of the individuals who are involved. They join boards in order to manage those buildings, and they've done a great job. That's why there's equity. However, from the perspective of the sector as a whole, participating in all of this, I think, also means having the courage to release that kind of equity into development, into the creation of new housing, and into your own expansion, not in a devil may care cavalier way, but in a managed way. And so one of the ways of doing that is through mergers and amalgamations. So certainly I've been involved in a couple where smaller organizations, oftentimes, I want to say at the end of their their lifespan, where you just have a board that's not really interested in proceeding. They've managed to merge into larger organizations, and then the assets are managed in a more of a portfolio manner, and it's possible to extract some of the equity that's been sitting in there and to redeploy it to the creation of new housing. Equity is the lifeblood of development. If you have it, you can attract lending to go with it, and that's what creates housing, and you can repeat. So that there's some of that available just by what exists today in the nonprofit sector. And you will see if you scan the literature today that there's a fair amount of work going into that. Some of the current CMHC solutions labs are aimed specifically at that. So I do think there is a counter role for the nonprofit sector and the community housing sector to look at that and worry that we're actually doing everything we can, not just looking to build Canada homes or to the movement of rental as a sort of panacea solution. Even when we think about the movement of rental, there's money to be put on the table in order to do that. Generating that money may mean amalgamation or mortgaging and so on. And as a side note, note to the government of Ontario, the restrictions on mortgaging or controlling of that equity, just for fear that at some point a nonprofit will go under, I think is probably a losing strategy ultimately in terms of what you're saving versus what you could gain. Of course, at some point in time, a nonprofit is going to go under. But in the world around us, we have tremendous developers, and sometimes developers go under too. So that releasing of equity is probably going to be better in the long run than keeping it restricted.
There's always interest in innovation in our space, and yet the need for steady, thoughtful, and sustained progress to deal with the challenges in front of us. What do you see as the qualities and attributes needed to lead successfully and scale impact today?
Well, sometimes when I go to conferences, people make this distinction. They'll say, well, there's the nonprofits and there's the private sector. And in point of fact, it's important to remember that private nonprofits are the private sector just as much as the private guys are. The difference is the profit, not in the capacity to be flexible in management and to be governed by a board of caring, smart people. So I think the construction of nonprofits in a way that you're able to be responsive, are able to be honest about the problems that are being faced and facing them down is important. Usually we hear people talk about the private sector being really a bastion of creativity. That's true, but the nonprofit sector has a tremendous amount of it as well. If you don't mind my saying, things like Construct and the land trust that Blue Door has been spearheading are examples of creativity. You're creating pathways for residents of your shelter system that did not exist before somebody thought of doing that, and then the next person thought of applying it in York Region. So creating that kind of pathway is not different than finding new ways of collaborating with a private developer or another nonprofit or a public sector entity on a particular site to create something new and special. It does require the same sort of simultaneous thinking that the private guys are pretty good at, which is both thinking big and small all at the same time. So thinking big about the strategy, thinking big about the ability to deliver impact, but also maintaining the discipline of developers, or the discipline of managing a construction site and so on, is really important. It's also important to know that I don't care what they tell you, something always goes wrong on construction sites. And just because something goes wrong does not make you bad at construction. It means that you're normal. You're bad at construction if you can't face that problem and deal with it openly and honestly and kind of try and work the problem, as they say. But all of that is the same between the two sectors in my mind, and there's no reason why a nonprofit wanting to do so and equipping itself with a board to do so can't be ambitious in that regard.
Unpacking your comment to our listeners of we need the discipline of the private sector and the care of community housing. What are your recommendations to Blue Door, the nonprofit space, the broader sector to build that balance effectively today?
Well, I think I think I've just explained why I think that's important, but I think that building that kind of carrying into a board's culture and who you choose to be on a board, that will all percolate down into the organization. And it means that we're approaching the creation of housing from the point of view of delivering on the human right to housing, of creating housing that is accessible across a broad range of income bands. And we're prepared to participate in lending programs from governments to do that. We're prepared to, obviously not take profit to do that because we're nonprofits, and all that. But it also means that the same rigor and discipline and reporting and all that stuff that we expect out of a private asset manager, I should say, out of a for-profit asset manager, should be expected of the nonprofit sector too. And once we start to get that reputation, it'll be a lot easier for nonprofits to walk into rooms and do the deals they want to do in order to create new units and to find willing and able and capable partners in the private for-profit sector.
John, thank you for not only sharing your time, but for laying out such a clear and compelling vision for the future of the housing landscape in Canada and our positioning within. This work has never been about buildings. It is always about the people first, and you coming on the show helps us think critically about the strategy, courage, and community we need to build and deliver housing effectively. At Blue Door and beyond, we're energized to be a part of that shift. Thank you again for joining us on the show today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That was John Fox, always bringing clarity, challenge, and practical ideas to push our sector forward. Whether it's rethinking ownership, unlocking policy opportunities, or reminding us to balance discipline with care, John helps us imagine what's possible when we act with intention. Thanks for listening to On the Way Home. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly, and I can't wait to see you next time.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.